Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Avenging Varus Part 4. Last time we saw the campaigning season come to a bit of a rocky end for the Romans. They made it out alive, but not without some significant losses. But it seemed like over the winter they were given some time to regroup, reorganize, morale was going back up, and we're heading into a new campaign season. Let's see if the Romans can exact more revenge against Arminius and these German tribes. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to regular exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The campaigning season of 15 AD had begun with the Roman armies plunging deep into Germanic lands, bringing the enemy to the precipice of defeat. Yet the final death blow could not be struck, as the invaders were forced to turn back with the coming of winter. It is now, with northern chill and barbarian steel striking at their backs, that a series of catastrophic blows would be dealt to the Romans in the...
Yeah, I mean, the Romans had a lot of successes against these Germanic tribes. They decimated some of these tribes, they destroyed a lot of settlements, but on their way out, we saw that Germanicus's fleet went through a truly terrible storm, and Caecina just barely made it out of the Battle of the Long Bridges. So even though this campaign was very successful, the Romans were, I guess, wounded on the way out. But like I said, they have had a bit of time to recover, and they're going back in.
A matter of just a few weeks. Drowned in the storm waves or slaughtered in the bogs, the Romans were brought to within an inch of being wiped out, virtually erasing everything they had fought for. Only cunning generalship, luck, and sheer desperation would see any of them limp back home alive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A combination of the generalship of Caecina and basically luck, and that luck took the form of Arminius's subordinates not listening to him. Arminius knew exactly what to do to completely defeat these Romans, but the rest of his war council wouldn't listen, and so the Romans managed to win, basically win, and escape.
To those battered survivors, the prospects of carrying on such a Pyrrhic war must have seemed impossible. However, the Empire had heard of their glorious exploits and now rose to support them with fresh waves of supplies and troops. Thus refreshed, Germanicus would now prepare to lead the legions on one last Herculean campaign to finish the job in Germania.
All right, one last campaign, boys. And, you know, this is really how Germanicus becomes a hero of the Roman people, a hero of the Empire. Like I said, he was already a popular fellow, but this is where he makes his name, and you can really understand why, you know, these campaigns are becoming known throughout the Empire. Rome is getting its revenge against those fearsome barbarians who had so disgracefully defeated us at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. But this young star Germanicus has come in, and he is retrieving Roman honor. He is avenging the disastrous defeat of Varus, at this point, years ago. And so Germanicus's reputation continues to build.
While the legions along the Rhine licked their wounds, Germanicus and his officers were busy assessing the situation. Their messages calling for support from the nearby provinces were met with overwhelming responses, and now the quartermasters had their hands full receiving the vast quantities of goods making their way to the front lines.
Nice.
Over the winter, many of these would be stockpiled in large depots and prepared for transport. Meanwhile, the troops were also in a state of recovery. Rested, fed, and bandaged up, they no longer feared for their lives. Thanks to celebrations, the disbursement of spoils, and award ceremonies led by Germanicus, they even began to feel like champions once more.
Well, yeah, and I mentioned this at the end of last episode. Sure, the whole campaign ended sort of badly. You know, the men were quite demoralized as they either returned from a disastrous storm or a near disastrous battle. But as winter went on and Germanicus went up and down the Rhine talking to his men and inspiring them, I imagine over time it was pretty easy to forget about those final near defeats and remember the rest of the successful campaign. And, you know, what was to come? Well, more successful campaigning.
Good old imperial propaganda and their own fierce sense of competition ensured that many troopers now clamored for a fight. The Germanic tribes to the east were similarly building their forces. However, they would not be able to do so as quickly. Many of their coalition had been horribly wounded in the last campaigns. Those who were not dead or dying struggled merely to survive in a land that had seen its towns sacked, its fields burned, and its herds stolen.
Yeah, well, as they mentioned, Rome has been, marching around the Germanic lands, burning towns, taking slaves, massacring people. That makes it a lot more difficult to mobilize men. And even outside of that, if you're in a mobilization competition and your army is Rome, I hate to say it, you are in a lot of trouble. I mean, think about how these different sides are organized, right? You have the Germans, this coalition, and so, making unified decisions, and I'm sure even mobilizing men on a grand scale is much more difficult. There's less resources to draw from, the decision-making isn't unified, and then take a look at Rome. This massive empire with unified decision-making, with so many resources and so much manpower to draw from. I mean, we've seen throughout Roman history, whether we're talking about the Civil Wars, or we're talking about the Punic Wars, or whatever, Rome can raise an insane amount of troops if it needs to.
Arminius and the other chiefs would have been in fierce negotiation among their ranks to keep everyone committed to the cause, whilst also seeking out new allies.
Right.
Thankfully, their near wins at the end of the 15 AD campaign made for a useful rallying cry to fan the flames of the resistance. Thus, as the months crept closer towards the start of the 16 AD campaigning season, both sides were geared up for one final climactic fight. As had occurred in the last few years, it would be the invading Romans who set the pace for the deadly dance that followed. This time, though, special considerations had to be made. After all, Germanicus had at his disposal over a quarter of Rome's legionary might, all concentrated in one place, which was too large to move as a single doom stack.
Yeah, that is a gigantic concentration of manpower. It also shows you, how devoted Rome, the Roman state, is to this mission. That amount of manpower, that concentration of troops, all in this one place, to achieve a mission that, sure, it is maybe partially about empire building, partially about securing the borders, but let's be honest, it's more about revenge and this mission to restore Roman honor, and yet they are still devoting this much manpower. Shows you how important it was to the Roman state, the Roman people, the Roman psyche.
Thus, he resolved to undertake a two-pronged assault, the main arm of which would consist of an amphibious assault along the North Sea. To this end, shipwrights and laborers had spent all winter building a massive armada of warships and transport vessels, which Tacitus states numbered over 1,000. Archaeology further backs this claim with evidence of an enormous section of the forest along the Rhine having been felled during this period.
Right.
This fleet would be key for establishing not just the initial beachhead, but also the vital supply lines to keep the Roman war machine running. Its needs were titanic. Germanicus commanded an estimated 50,000 soldiers, with many more support units, pack animals, and camp followers, all requiring supplies. Basically, the equivalent of feeding a sizable city. By some estimates, this would have called for 165,000 pounds of grain a day. Strategically, moving this much material overland would have courted disaster, given the ease with which Germanic armies could raid and cut off such supply lines. Thus, it would be the very life-giving rivers of Germania that would serve as the arteries into which the Roman invasion force would be injected. While the ships were being constructed, Germanicus sent one of his lieutenants to once again engage the battered Chatti. These had not yet recovered from the previous year's beatdown, and the Romans had no pity in their hearts.
Oh.
The invaders swiftly
Yeah, the Chatti have not been having a good time at all.
took the Chatti out of the war for a second year in a row, only being slightly delayed by bad weather. Tacitus dismisses the move as pointless, considering that there really wasn't anything that they could loot. But the army group took the wife of the war chief hostage, ensuring
Here we have the analysis of Tacitus to help us along. a Roman historian who was actually devoted to the details. Unlike some of his contemporaries, I won't be naming names.
That his spirit was as crippled as those of his people, most of whom lay dead in the silent forests. Germanicus himself then marched out with a different army unit, about 6 legions strong, to relieve the siege of a Roman fort that was still on the German side of the Rhine.
Wow.
When the besiegers heard that a full Roman army was bearing down on them, they melted away into the woods before the relief army had arrived.
Probably smart.
Germanicus, having accomplished his goal without any bloodshed, decided to take the initiative. After all, he was already across the Rhine with no apparent resistance. Why not push the advantage? Thus, while the amphibious invasion with their 1,000 ships got underway along the northern seas, the legions immediately set to work building infrastructure for the overland assault force. Starting from the position of the relief fort, they now built a defensive network of walls, towers, and bridges back to the Rhine. As they did so, elements of the northern fleet began to push their way upstream through the waterways of Germania.
Wow. Once again, just want to re-emphasize the insane amount of resources being used here, and also, it's really crazy to me that this many resources were put into this much infrastructure was constructed, this many troops were on the opposite side of the Rhine, when once again, we think to the future of Rome, and, Germania will remain Germania. It will not come under the control of the Roman Empire. Now, as some of you have pointed out, that is more due to sort of long-term factors, not due to this campaign in particular. In fact, Rome will find great success throughout this campaign, but it is crazy to think that the sort of influence Rome is exerting on the eastern side of the Rhine in Germania at this point, and then think long-term, the sort of lack of influence Rome will have over the eastern side of the Rhine.
These were quickly able to link up with Germanicus. Now, transports bearing fresh supplies and troops refreshed the legions. For the individual troopers, hard at work with the Delabra, this must have been a huge sigh of relief. The dark forests and murky bogs that had haunted them the previous year were now being felled and filled. Meanwhile, watchtowers, patrols, and scouting parties confirmed that there was no enemy in sight.
And this is a very Roman attitude. This is, I feel like, sort of one of the motifs of Roman expansion. You level whatever you don't like, the frightening forests, the scary bogs, and you build what you do want to see. Forts, bridges, sentry towers. This is what the Romans are sort of famous for doing. Like I said, going in, leveling whatever they don't want there, and then going forth with a massive construction and infrastructure building project. Of course, the Roman army was fantastic at marching and fighting, all that sort of stuff, but engineering and building, those were absolutely strengths of the Roman army as well.
All nearby communities either fled or bent the knee. The army brimmed with confidence. When one tribe, the Angrivari, attempted to buck its Roman overlords, Germanicus immediately sent men to put it down. Tacitus, ever the Roman historian, condenses this activity into a single chilling sentence. Quote, "He sent Stertinius there with the cavalry and light infantry, so that their betrayal would be punished with fire and blood."
Ooh.
Everything was going according to plan. However, the Germanic tribes would not go down so easily. They had realized the futility of holding the western banks of the Weser, and were rallying their forces on the eastern side, saving their full strength for now.
Isn't that crazy? Not only do the Germans now have to remain to the east of the Rhine, but now to the east of the Weser, the Romans at this point are saying, the eastern banks of the Rhine, yeah, we've got that. We're building forts, bridges, we've got our ships up and down the rivers. Man, we've got control of this area, no big deal. And so the Germanic tribes under Arminius, they're like, all right, well, we better consolidate a little further east then to remain safe.
Watching, waiting. As the Romans advanced their works to the Weser River and prepared to cross, the Carusi and their allies moved to intercept them. With Arminius at their head, they arrayed for battle. This tense standoff would finally be broken when the leaders of both sides rode to the river in a preliminary engagement of diplomacy. The river divided not just bitter enemies, but families.
Yeah,
Arminius, the Romano-German traitor, stood opposite his brother Flaus, who had chosen to remain loyal to the invaders.
Yep, the Romano-German traitor Arminius. Of course, all of this depends on your perspective. If you're coming at it from a Roman perspective, then Arminius is a real despicable type. Though you might respect him for his competency and skill in warfare. If you're coming at this from, the German side of things, then Arminius is a hero. He's defending his indigenous land from conquest by the Romans. So, really depends on your perspective. But we see, and I mentioned this before, the split that usually happens when Rome shows up in a new land. Some of these local peoples will try and fight back. They will often band together in some sort of coalition. And some of them will bend the knee to Rome for a variety of different reasons. Maybe they think it's their only way to survive. Maybe they're convinced that the Romans are going to win. They have the momentum. And so it's just better to side with the Romans. Or a lot of this often has to do with, in this case, say, inter-Germanic fighting and conflicts. If you have beef with another tribe, well, maybe you'll side with the Romans in order to get their aid so you can come out on top. Like I said, we've seen all of this stuff before in Hispania, in Gaul, this pattern of, conflict between local tribes, some siding with the Romans, some not, forming coalitions. This is a repeating pattern that, we're seeing basically a similar thing here with all these Germanic tribes. So yes, tribes will be split, families will be split, peoples will be split with the intervention of the Roman Empire.
And had the scars to prove it. In a scene straight out of a Hollywood movie, the two would come face to face. Tacitus sets the scene for us. Quote, that brother Flaus, by name, was serving in the army, a conspicuous figure both from his loyalty and from the loss of an eye through a wound received during Tiberius's term of command some few years before. Leave was granted, and Stertinius took him down to the river. Walking forward, he was greeted by Arminius, who, dismissing his own escort, demanded that the archers posted along our side of the stream should also be withdrawn. When these had retired, he asked his brother whence the disfigurement of his face. On being told the place and battle, he inquired what reward he had received. Flaus mentioned his increased pay, the chain of medals, the crown, and other military decorations. Arminius scoffed at the cheap rewards of servitude. They now began to argue.
Right, and right now we're getting a great breakdown of those two different perspectives. Someone who has decided to serve the Romans and someone who has decided to resist. Flaus talks about the rewards that he has received, and you can sort of extrapolate this, generalize this to a broader point, not to get too metaphorical, but the idea that, well, you're a Germanic tribe, you side with the Romans, you can get material rewards. And then someone like Arminius, maybe representative of the Germanic tribes that continue to resist, scoff at that. And they say, really? You would sell out your people for those, cheap trinkets? We are fighting for our people, our independence. You can see the breakdown very well here with these two characters.
From their opposite points of view. Flaus insisted on Roman greatness, the power of the Caesar, the heavy penalties for the vanquished, the mercy always waiting for him who submitted himself. Even Arminius' wife and child were not treated as enemies. His brother, meanwhile, urged the sacred call of their country, their ancestral liberty, the gods of their German hearths, and their mother, who prayed with himself, that Flaus would not choose the title of renegade and traitor to his people, to the kindred of his wife, to the whole of his race, in fact, before that of their liberator.
Yeah, and like I said, we've seen this pattern repeat time and time again. I'm reminded of, for example, the Gallic hero Vercingetorix, who is still, I don't know to what extent, but still remembered as a bit of a hero in French history today. I wonder if Arminius is still remembered in modern German history. Any of y'all who live in Germany or are German will have to let me know. But, this is a conflict that happened a long time ago. There's not much point picking sides. There's no point really moralizing it, but I can't help but feel a bit of sympathy for sort of the underdogs of it all, the Vercingetorixes, the Arminiuses, those who are trying to defend their people, defend their countries from this massive empire, this massive imperialist empire trying to control their territory. I can't help but feel a bit of sympathy for that.
From this point, they drifted little by little into recriminations, and not even the intervening river would have prevented a duel had not Stertinius run up and laid a restraining hand on Flaus, who enraged was shouting for his weapons and his horse. On the other side, Arminius was visible, shouting threats and challenging his brother to single combat. He kept interjecting insults in Latin, as he had service in the Roman camp as a captain of native auxiliaries.
Yeah, I mean, look, Arminius knew. We already talked about this. He was Roman educated. He had this Roman military experience. I'm sure he could go back and forth in Latin just as well as his native Germanic language.
While the exact words of this verbal joust were likely manufactured by authors and should not be taken at face value, they do reveal some truths about the Roman perspective. Based on the arguments made by Flaus, we see imperial propaganda at work. This was not a war.
Right, and before he gets to those points, this is a great way to break down these sources. Remember, even with our more reliable Roman historians, when they give us specific scenes or specific lines that were said, more likely than not, these were probably manufactured. And so these words are actually more a reflection of the Roman perspective than they are the actual event that took place. So that's a very intelligent way to look at these sources. And by the way, you should basically look at every source this way. See what perspective it's coming from and how that might impact the words that are being written down on the page. You can't just take sources at face value.
Against the Germanic people? No. The quarrel was merely against the traitorous elements in their ranks.
Right.
The Romans were merciful and generous masters, ready to greet any who laid down their arms as friends and allies. Of course.
Which is, of course, this sort of extremely imperialist, coercive perspective. They say, look, we're plenty generous, just submit to us. It's like, okay, what happens if we don't totally submit? Well, your town will be burned down, we'll kill a bunch of you, we'll sell the rest of you into slavery. It's like, oh, so merciful and generous. Just ask the Gauls. Well, you don't need to ask the Gauls, the Germans are going through it right at this moment, but it is a good view of the Roman perspective, seeing themselves as the one and only civilized empire, not fighting necessarily against the Germanic peoples, but against the traitorous elements, as they put it. Though, there was a ton of discriminatory views amongst the Romans towards these barbarians. If you would have asked your average Roman, they would have had lots of negative things to say about the German people. So, once again, this is all the Roman perspective and sort of the manufactured Roman perspective at that.
The brutality of the previous years would certainly beg to differ, but this was the game being played. After all, there were still many Germanic auxiliaries serving in the Roman military at this time, and imperial commanders clearly found some success in winning others to their cause with words, if not by steel. By trotting out the loyal Germanic warrior Flaus, perhaps they might further induce others to give up the resistance before battle was held.
Well, this is also the Roman way. If you look at the entirety of Roman history, this is a conquering, expanding empire. What it does is it conquers these peoples, and then it tries to integrate them into the empire, and a big part of that is either sometimes forcing or, coercing in some way these peoples into military service. That's a pretty good way to integrate them into your expanding empire. So once again, it's not like this is something necessarily novel. This is a trick that the Romans had used time and time before.
Whatever the case, though, it seems that the bulk of the Germanic tribes remained undeterred and formed a formidable battle line across the plain on the eastern banks of the Weser. Seeing this, Germanicus spared little time on further propaganda games. He immediately dispatched scouts to find a way across. When a ford was located downriver, a large cavalry detachment under Stertinius was sent to ride out and establish a surprise flank against the Germans. Meanwhile, his primus Pulis, a man named Emilius, was sent with another detachment of cavalry to find a ford upriver, forming a classic pincer maneuver. Germanicus anticipated that the enemy would move to counter these forces. Thus, when he observed the enemy center begin to reform, he now ordered a charge straight through the center.
And now, by the way, before we really get into it, we've got sort of a direct clash between the Romans under Germanicus and the Germans under Arminius. This is sort of what we've been waiting for the whole time. This is the major engagement between the two sides. So far, Arminius has done a pretty good job of holding back, waiting for the right moment to strike, not necessarily getting into these massive engagements, unless, like the Battle of the Long Bridges, the Romans were weakened and vulnerable. But now, it really is the two sides with their two most famous commanders at the time going right at each other.
Where the river current was at its fiercest. Taking up the charge would be the elite Batavian cavalry, famed for their bravery and strength. The gamble here appears to have been to use the assault to fix the enemy in place and buy time for the flanking forces, and, if luck would have it, perhaps even rout the tribes entirely. However, Arminius was ever the clever commander. He sent troops to intercept the cavalry on the sides, while ordering his own forces in the center to undertake a feigned flight. This succeeded in drawing the Batavians into a clearing surrounded by woods, at which point an ambush was sprung that sealed them in.
Smart.
The elite auxiliaries were now forced to fight on all sides.
Yeah, Arminius, wily and competent as always, and, I always want to point this out. We talk about a feigned retreat, put it simply, but that it can be a pretty difficult maneuver to pull off. It does take a certain amount of discipline. Remember, you have to have your men retreat without falling into a real rout. It's very easy once you have your men start backing up or start, quote-unquote retreating, for them to really start retreating and just running away. So your men need to have the discipline to feign a retreat, and then you need to have the organization to spring this trap, send these hidden forces in to surround the enemy. So, this, while it's not necessarily the most complex maneuver, it is a maneuver that has a certain degree of complexity and takes a certain degree of discipline and organization.
They only managed to hang on due to their high levels of discipline and excellent gear. Slowly, though, they were being picked off, either in close quarters or by the flurry of missiles that rained down among their packed ranks. When all seemed lost, the Batavian commander, Cariovalda, and his retinue made the ultimate sacrifice. They suicidally plunged straight into the jaws of the Germanic line, whilst ordering their brethren to punch through the back. Thankfully, their daring escape was facilitated by the arrival of Roman cavalry from the wings who had come to the rescue. This ragtag group of survivors now pulled back to the Weser. First blood had gone to Arminius. However, the action was not a complete disaster.
First blood had gone to Arminius, but, we've still got a bit to go. The Romans still have a lot of forces to commit, and you can see, even in a situation like that, where Arminius, was a little tricky, as always, the Roman, in this case, cavalry, but of course this applies to the infantry as well, are incredibly well disciplined, determined, and truly faithful to the cause. They're willing to stand there and give it all in this battle and perform those sorts of daring maneuvers if necessary.
In the chaos, Germanicus had actually managed to make an uncontested crossing with the legions. Most of these immediately set to work constructing a camp to secure this strategic victory. Meanwhile, others dispersed to form a protective screen, while several units prepared to join the fray.
I laugh because it's a Roman army, because the first instinct is to build a camp. Just so Roman. We've seen it before in this very series.
Yet by this point, Germanicus could see that things were quickly falling apart, and there was no need feeding yet more men into the bloody fields ahead. After all, who knew what other traps had been set by his wily opponent? Therefore, the Roman commander called a retreat, settled down for the night, and made ready to tend to the survivors as they trickled in. Once more, Germanicus and his officers huddled in a tent to plan.
Alright, so sort of a bit of an opening skirmish, I suppose you could call it, that basically went to Arminius, but like I said, we've still got a lot of forces to be committed on both sides. We haven't reached that sort of major engagement I was talking about. Now we have to see what both sides plan to do, particularly Germanicus, what he decides to do this coming day.
And their next moves. As they did so, they made sure to read all the latest reports coming in from the units of the exploratores and the speculatores who acted as the eyes and ears of the army. Luckily, fortune would smile upon them. Apparently, a deserter from the German camp had turned traitor, bringing with him the secrets of the enemy.
Ooh.
These supposedly revealed that Arminius had selected a battlefield and was preparing a preliminary attack as soon as this night. Such important, yet potentially false information had to be confirmed. It seems that Roman spies were able to verify the claims by creeping close to the enemy lines, whereupon they heard the neighing of horses and the movement of a tumultuous host. A fight was imminent.
Wow,
Germanicus went into high alert, and
so Arminius has really grabbed the initiative. As always, he's being a little sneaky, and he's preparing to catch the Romans unawares. But, due to, I'm sure, a combination of Roman scouting and just pure luck, now Germanicus knows about it.
and wanted to be sure that his own forces were ready to meet any challenge that might be thrown against them. Disguising himself, he secretly slipped from the augury tent and wandered between the campfires, eavesdropping on conversations and even joining in on others, trying to get the measure of his men.
Interesting.
What he heard was encouraging. Tacitus tells us that, quote, Germanicus enjoyed the men talk positively about himself, while they acknowledged that they ought to repay him with their gratitude in battle, and at the same time sacrifice the perfidious violators of peace to a glorious vengeance.
And now I do wonder, once again, if this actually happened. This sounds like one of those stories that was constructed by historians after the fact, because, it's such a nice little story, Germanicus gets to walk around his camp, blending in with the men and chatting with them, and he hears all these good things. There might be some truth to this, right? I mean, I'm sure Germanicus would have wanted to survey his men, but this absolutely could be a completely constructed story.
This was a good sign. He was doubly reassured by the jeering responses of the sentries when a rider came from the Germanic camp, shouting to all who might hear that Arminius was willing to pay any Romans handsomely should they turn traitor. The soldiers responded, "Let daylight come, let battle be given, then we'll take your land and carry off your women."
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile for the Romans to try and convert Germans to their side, and we saw them doing that earlier. They have sort of a tradition of doing that, but the Germans to try and convert the highly faithful and disciplined Romans to their side, yeah, I don't think you're really going to get anywhere with that.
As the sun rose the next day, the Romans were ready and waiting before their camp in battle order. This seems to have thwarted an initial skirmishing attack on the camp, which pulled back without any exchange of missiles.
Nice.
Both sides now prepared for a pitched battle, making rousing speeches.
Alright, so Arminius didn't strike maybe as quickly as we might have thought from that report, and the Romans were ready for it, so his sort of initial trick has sort of been undermined. Let's see where we go from here. Will we get an honest-to-goodness sort of face-to-face battle now?
To their men. Germanicus spoke of the superiority of Roman discipline, their gear, and their bravery that would see them win out.
Yeah.
The legions must only weather the initial storm, and victory would be theirs. Meanwhile, Arminius roused his own men, assuring them that the Romans they faced were cowardly fugitives and mutineers. Half their backs were covered from the wounds of retreat, while the limbs of the rest were battered by storms. Far from their fleet and their forts, the Romans held no hope of advantage. He finished by shouting, quote, "Remember only their greed, their cruelty, their pride. Is anything left for us but to retain our freedom, or to die before we are enslaved?"
Yeah, and you can really see the motivations of both sides. You look at the Romans, they're doing this for revenge, basically. They have been deeply, deeply wounded by the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. They all remember it, they're angry, they're ready to fight back, prove something to these damn Germans, and, well, wipe them out if they can. Go to the other side, these Germanic tribes, they're fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their people, You can imagine how both sides are extremely motivated and extremely dedicated to the cause. Now, of course, there are outliers. Not everybody's going to be feeling all its emotions rushing through them. there are going to be some auxiliaries and mercenaries and those who are a little less committed, but I'd say overall both sides have these motivations that are really pushing them forward.
With that, the two armies advanced on the plain of Idistaviso. As the Roman forces deployed with drilled discipline, the Germanic tribesmen flowed down from the slopes to meet them. Arminius had some 50,000 or more warriors that massed in their tribes and clans along a wide front that stretched across the width of the plain up to the forest.
Yeah, so this is a large-scale battle, you could say. We're talking about many soldiers on either side.
Here along the slopes were posted the Cherushi, who aimed to rush down upon the enemy once battle was joined. Before them were arranged a thin screen of skirmishers. As for the cavalry, their strength and position are unattested to. Perhaps they are left out from our records because of their low numbers, with protection of the flanks being yielded to the infantry and the terrain.
Interesting.
Opposite them was an enormous Roman army of some 74,000 men deployed into 3 lines.
Oh my goodness!
The first was made up of several thousand Gallic and Germanic auxiliaries backed by archers. Behind these stood 4 legions, with the 2 Praetorian cohorts sent by Tiberius at their center.
Oh wow, they've got the big guns out. First off, that is a massive army. We've got Praetorian cohorts, the legions, the auxiliaries in the front. I mean, everybody from across the empires come together to fight this damn battle.
In the final line stood 4 more legions, light troops, and the remaining allied units.
Right.
Some 8,000 cavalry were arranged on the Roman left by the forested flank, with an additional 2,000 mounted archers.
Right, and the Romans also have a pretty strong cavalry force compared to the Germans, who said their cavalry was unattested. I don't know what exactly that means. They didn't have cavalry. We don't necessarily have record of it. So you can't really make a claim because we don't know how present a cavalry was on the Germanic side. But say they didn't have one, and that's why we don't have reports of it, then that would seem to me to be a pretty big disadvantage.
By this point, it must have been around midday. The sun shone brightly overhead as over 100,000 men dripped with sweat in anticipation of what was to come. Finally, the initiative was seized by the Germanic tribes, who now unleashed an attack on the front lines.
All right,
Here
we go.
That these crashed upon the Romans with a mighty fury, Arminius and the Cherushi nearly piercing through the ranks of the auxiliary and the archers. However, this was clearly anticipated by Germanicus, who had used his most disposable troops as a breaker. Now, with the first wave having crashed, he sent forth the cavalry to assault the flank and the rear.
Yeah,
The elite riders.
that's what I'm saying. If the Germans didn't have cavalry or didn't have significant cavalry at this point, the Romans are going to have a big advantage. They can use their cavalry to be this mobile strike force, send them in where they need them. Cavalry, even a quote-unquote small amount of cavalry compared to how many infantry there are. We're talking about tens of thousands of infantry, a couple thousand cavalry, but even that can make a big, big difference where it matters.
Under Stertinius smashed into the melee by the forest's edge. Missiles flew in all directions, and even Arminius was injured, though fighting on nonetheless. At this point, an auspicious omen was observed. 8 eagles, 1 for each legion, flew over the battlefield.
There you go.
Seeing this, Germanicus shouted to his men, quote, "Go, follow the birds of Rome, follow the true gods of our legions." And with that, the colossus of the Roman army advanced in mass.
Man.
Their crushing weight added to the front, in combination with the flanking maneuvers of the cavalry, proved inexorable. All discipline broke down within the German army.
Wow.
Those at the front tried to flee from the grim Roman tide.
So there you go. We got that face-to-face, full-scale engagement that we've been waiting for. And as you might have expected, without the ability to use any of his little tricks, just a simple engagement, the Roman numbers, discipline, armor and weapons, training, all of that in the end won out.
While those who had been held in reserve charged into the fray. This swirling of desperate men only added further to the chaotic disintegration of the tribal battle lines. The Germanic commander, Iguiomerus, managed to escape, while Arminius also fled on horse, having smeared blood on his face to hide his identity.
Wow.
I'll now quote Tacitus. The rest were cut down in every direction. Many, in attempting to swim across the Visurgis, were overwhelmed under a storm of missiles, or by the force of the current, or by the rush of fugitives and the falling in of the banks. Some, in their ignominious flight, climbed the tops of trees, and as they were hiding themselves in the boughs, archers were brought up, and they were shot for sport. Others were dashed to the ground by the felling of the trees. It was a great victory, and without bloodshed to us. From morning to nightfall.
Yeah, without bloodshed to us. The same cannot be said for the other side. To my understanding, I don't know if there was a sort of take no prisoners policy, but basically, this was a very brutal cleanup operation from the Romans. I will put it that way.
The enemy was slaughtered, and 10 miles were covered with arms and dead bodies.
Yep.
For the Romans, this was a most glorious victory that surely wiped clean the disgrace of Teutoburg.
Yeah.
After all, littered among the fields were the arms of many who had perpetrated that dreadful act. These would now be dedicated to the Emperor.
You know, and this is why I say, and not to spoil too much in the future, but, you know, I'm sure you can kind of tell, the Roman campaigns are overall going to be successful, and we've just had this major Roman victory. This is why I clarify throughout this series, you know, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was very influential, but it was far more influential as sort of a scar on the Roman psyche than it was as an actual tactical or strategic defeat. You know, in practical terms, the defeat itself, you know, it didn't have that many long-lasting implications. Really, the long-lasting implications came from what it did to the Roman mindset and how they responded. We're seeing here this incredible Roman victory. Roman success will continue. So when we think about Rome's long-term relationship with Germania, you know, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest plays a big role because it shapes the Roman perspective and the Roman mindset. But in practical terms, it's not like that initial loss will prevent Rome from conquering this territory. You know, that is not how it works out in the long term. There's a lot of other factors at play here.
Emperor, with the construction of a massive trophy. It was a brutal monument, an uprooted tree adorned with the gear of the vanquished. Shields, spears, swords, and chainmail hanging from every branch and crowned with helmets. But even this was not enough to convey the enormity of the victory. Around its base, the legionaries then constructed a mound with yet more heaps of trophies taken from the fallen. Finally, nailed to the grisly trunk would be plaques with the names of the defeated tribes. Surely, the surviving Germans would cower at this most formidable of displays. Yet they did not. Instead, Arminius and the tribes found themselves burning with anger at this most egregious affront to their honor.
Yeah.
They now made ready
Next time we've got another major battle to come.
for one last attempt at victory.
Yep.
However, the Germanic chieftains realized that this could not be achieved in a pitched battle. Their greatest and final hope was to recreate what they had achieved at Teutoburg 7 long years ago.
Yeah, I think they're exactly right. I think they are exactly right. The pitched battle is, you know, not to the advantage of the Germans. As we've seen, they are best when they can surprise the Romans. And that's where Arminius is also best. I mean, his skills come from the fact that he's a tricky little character. He's good at taking advantage of Roman vulnerability. So I would have to agree with that assessment. Anyway, another fantastic episode. We have a major Roman victory. You know, so far, the Roman campaigns have been very successful, though, you know, we've seen some mixed success at points. Battle of the Long Bridges, that was definitely mixed. You know, that storm that Germanicus and his troop faced. So it's been mostly up, but a little down. But this singular battle, this is the biggest victory the Romans have seized so far, and it truly is a massive, massive victory. And of course, you know, there is more to come, which I'm excited to get to. If you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below. And with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.